July 26, 1959, Saratoga Springs, New York. An old man dies in a room at the Gideon Putnam Hotel. He is 83 years old. He is alone. His name means almost nothing to the hotel staff, and the obituary in the New York Times will be restrained, as if the editor feared disturbing the dust on the archive shelves. The death certificate states, James Hazen Hyde. Cause of death? Natural causes. But if the coroner had a poetic gift, he would have written differently. Cause of death: one dinner eaten 54 years ago. This old man was a walking ghost. For half a century, he lived in the shadow of an event that lasted only 6 hours. He was the man who committed the most expensive suicide in financial history. And he remained alive, but destroyed his reputation, his legacy, and his empire with the efficiency of a guillotine. Let's turn back the clock. January 31st, 1905, New York. Sherry's Restaurant on Fifth Avenue. That night, it's not just a ball taking place here. Here, a burning of money is happening that would make Roman emperors blush. The evening's budget was $200,000. Stop for a second and think about this figure. $200,000 in 1905. If we adjust it to the 2024 Consumer Price Index, we get about $7 million. $7 million for one evening. But even this figure doesn't reflect the reality. At that time, the average annual income of an American family was less than $500. James Hazen Hyde spent 400 annual wages of ordinary workers in one night. What were these money paid for? For 15,000 roses, with which the walls were entwined from floor to ceiling. For a real lawn, the sod for which was cut and brought into the banquet hall, so that guests could tread on live grass while being on the second floor of a building in the center of Manhattan. For Paul Roget champagne of the 1889 vintage, which flowed as if New York's water system had been connected to the wine cellars of Epernay. For a 9-course dinner where lobster and pheasant were served. This was not a party. This was a coronation. James Hazen Hyde, the 29-year-old heir, believed that New York lay at his feet. He was vice president of the Equitable Life Insurance Society. Under his control were assets worth $400 million. To understand the scale, this was more than the gold reserves of many European monarchies of that time. He was, perhaps, the most eligible bachelor in America. Handsome, rich, educated. But the morning after the ball, he woke up not as a king, but as the nation's chief villain. Newspapers came out with headlines that screamed about a feast during the plague. The public asked one simple question: whose banquet was this? And the answer was horrifying. These were not Hyde's personal money. These were the money of widows and orphans, money of policyholders. Every cent spent on French lace and imported orchids was taken from the pocket of a person who saved, penny by penny, to provide for his family after death. James Hazen Hyde did not just throw a ball. He spat in the face of the American dream of thrift. This evening became the trigger that launched a chain reaction of disasters. Following the newspaper articles came the prosecutors. Following the prosecutors came the legislators. The equitable empire, which his father had built for 40 years, sank in 40 days. Hyde lost everything: his position, influence, homeland. He was forced to flee to Paris and live there half his life in exile, like a deposed monarch. But the irony of fate is that this very ball shaped the world we live in today. Look at your insurance policy. If you have life, auto, or property insurance, you are protected by laws written because of James Hyde. The so-called Armstrong Laws, regulating the insurance business in the United States, emerged as a direct response to the madness that took place in Sherry's restaurant. Modern financial transparency was born from the foam of that very 1905 champagne. Moreover, the echo of this story can be heard even in spy novels. Our hero's son, Henry Baldwin Hyde, born already in exile, spent his entire life trying to wash the stain of shame from the family name. He became not a banker, but a spy. A legendary spy of the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's predecessor, known as Monsieur Henri. The man who helped plan the Allied landing in Normandy was the son of the man who destroyed his life for a costume ball. This story is not just a chronicle of wealth. It is a court record of how pride blinds, and the market does not forgive mistakes. We will see how this mountain of gold was created. We will walk through the corridors of power where the fates of millions were decided. We will peek into the menu of that very dinner, and into the accounting books where the price of vanity was entered in red ink. But to understand how one can fall from such a height, we need to return to the beginning, not to James, but to the man who created this golden pedestal, to his father, to the founder who knew the price of every cent and who, probably, turned in his grave that night when his son ordered 15,000 roses. To understand the nature of the 1905 catastrophe, we need to look at the foundation on which it stood. And this foundation was mixed with a mortar of pure testosterone, Protestant ethics, and a brilliant financial pyramid. The name of this foundation is Henry Baldwin Hyde. If his son James was Louis XVI heading to the guillotine, then Henry was Napoleon, who redrew the world map with his bayonet. Henry Hyde did not inherit the empire. He gnawed it out. In 1859, at the age of 25, he worked as a clerk in the largest insurance company of that time, Mutual Life. One fine day, he walked into the office of the company president, Frederick Winston, and announced that he was quitting to create his own firm, which would become bigger, richer, and more powerful. Winston laughed in his face. He said, "Henry, you won't last a year." That was a mistake. Hyde had the memory of an elephant and the energy of a steam locomotive. To spite his former boss, he rented an office right above the Mutual Life office, hung a huge equitable sign that blocked the sun from the windows of his former bosses, and started the war. The capital of his new company was only $100,000, but his ambitions were measured in billions. Henry Hyde was a tall, physically powerful man with a piercing gaze that contemporaries described as hypnotic. He did not just sell insurance policies. He sold immortality and status. But how exactly was this mountain of money built? The secret of Equitable's success lay not in simple protection from death. Henry Hyde introduced in the USA a system known as tontine. It was a devilishly clever scheme bordering on gambling. The essence was simple. You buy a policy and pay premiums for 20 years. If you die earlier, the family gets the insurance. But if you survive, and this is the most important part, you get not only your money, but also the share of those who died or stopped paying. It was a bet on survival. The winner takes all. This mechanism created within the company what financiers called surpluses or free capital. These were hundreds of millions of dollars in cash that legally did not belong to the shareholders, but were actually at the full disposal of Henry Hyde. He could invest them, buy influence, build palaces. It was these very monies, accumulated from the deaths and ruins of thousands of investors, that would become the fuel his son would burn at balls. Henry Hyde was obsessed with monumentalism. Paper figures were not enough for him. He needed a physical embodiment of power. In 1870, he began construction of the Equitable Building headquarters on Broadway 120. This was the first office building in the world where passenger elevators became the basis of logistics. Before Hyde, upper floors were considered cheap because it was hard to climb there on foot. Hyde installed Elisha Otis elevators and turned the real estate market upside down. Now the higher you sat, the more expensive it cost. The penthouse was born in Henry Hyde's head. The building was a city within a city. Its own lawyers, its own doctors, its own restaurants, and its own vaults stuffed with gold. However, behind this facade hid a man who was burning himself alive with work. Henry Hyde did not know what rest was. He controlled every paperclip. He created a network of spies inside the company to know what the clerks whispered about in the restrooms. By the end of the 19th century, Equitable became the largest insurance company in the world. But the price was paid with the founder's health. He developed chronic heart disease, exacerbated by constant stress. In this atmosphere of titanic labor and paranoia, his son James grew up. He was a late child. Henry was already 42 years old when the heir was born. The father idolized the boy. Unlike himself, he did not want James to know need or hard labor. James grew up in greenhouse conditions. French governesses, private schools, trips to Europe. The father was building for him not just a business, but a throne. Henry Hyde made the classic mistake of a dictator. He prepared a crown for the successor, but did not teach him to hold the sword. He thought that the Equitable machine was so perfect that it could run on autopilot. On May 2nd, 1899, Henry Baldwin Hyde's heart stopped. The Iron Man broke. Diagnosis: overwork and heart failure. He left behind a fortune that could not be spent in one lifetime, and a controlling stake in the company, 51%, which gave absolute power over $400 million in assets. But there was one but: the will. Henry understood that his son, who was only 23 years old at the time of his father's death, was still too young and flighty. Therefore, the will contained a clause: James would gain full control over the shares only upon reaching 30 years of age. Until then, the company was to be managed by a trust fund and the board of directors. In fact, power passed to the regent, James Alexander, the father's old associate, who became president while young James contented himself with the position of vice president. This 7-year wait became fatal. James Hazen Hyde found himself in a trap. He had money, a title, a luxurious office, but no real responsibility. He did not need to struggle for survival like his father. He was bored. And a bored young man with unlimited credit of trust and access to the corporate treasury is a ticking time bomb. James began to seek himself not in accounting books, but in aesthetics. He fell in love with France. He started wearing starched collars so high that it was difficult for him to turn his head. He developed a habit of pinning a bouquet of Parma violets to his jacket lapel every day. For the stern Wall Street bankers, who remembered his father as a shark in a cheap suit, this looked like an insult. While the old guard of Equitable earned money through Henry's cynical schemes, the young heir spent it on creating the image of the Sun King. The chasm between the stern founder and the glamorous heir grew every day. Henry Hyde built a fortress capable of withstanding financial storms and stock market panics. But he did not foresee that the threat would come not from outside, but from within. He did not install protection against the stupidity of his own son. The empire was ready for war, but it turned out to be completely unprepared for a party. In 1905, the regency term was coming to an end. James was about to turn 30 years old. The old wolves on the board of directors, led by James Alexander, looked at the calendar in horror. They understood. As soon as the boy with the violets got 51% of the shares, their power would end. They needed a pretext to destroy him before his birthday. They needed a scandal. And James, in his naive pride, served them this scandal on a silver platter garnished with lobsters and truffles. Henry Hyde's death opened the floodgates. If the father was a dam holding back the flow of gold to generate energy, then the son became a breach through which that energy poured into the void. The 20th century dawned, and America entered an era that Mark Twain sarcastically dubbed the Gilded Age. Not golden, note, but gilded. A thin layer of shine on the outside, concealing cheap cast iron within. And James Hazen Hyde became the ideal, almost caricatured symbol of that time. While the Equitable Board of Directors, consisting of gray-haired elders in black frock coats, continued to arrive at work at 8 in the morning, James turned his life into a continuous spectacle. He did not just spend money. He engaged in what sociologists would later call conspicuous consumption. Owning things was not enough for him. He needed the world to see him owning them. His main passion became not stocks and bonds, but horses. But not racing, where there is excitement and risk, but coaching. The art of driving a 4-horse team harnessed to an antique mail coach. It was an incredibly expensive and utterly pointless hobby, available only to the elite. James spent tens of thousands of dollars on buying the finest stallions, building stables in the center of Manhattan, and ordering carriages that were exact replicas of 18th century French aristocratic coaches. One day, he decided to break the speed record for a mail coach journey from New York to Philadelphia. For this event, which had no practical sense whatsoever, he organized horse changes at every station. 78 of the finest thoroughbreds awaited him along the route. He raced down the roads, changing teams like gloves, just to prove that he could outrun time with money. Newspapers wrote about it with enthusiasm, while ordinary Equitable clerks, reading these stories during their lunch break, began asking uncomfortable questions. Where does the vice president get so much free time? In the office on Broadway, 120, James behaved not like a hired manager, but like a monarch granting audiences. His office resembled more the boudoir of a king's favorite than a financier's workspace. The walls were hung with tapestries. Rare vases stood on the tables. Every morning, a hairdresser came to his private office to curl his mustache and style his hair, while secretaries read out stock exchange summaries. He started the fashion of wearing 2 fresh violets in his lapel. In the morning, they were dark purple Parma violets, and by evening, he changed them to lighter ones so they would harmonize with the gas lamp lighting. For the old guard, people like James Alexander, who built the company alongside his father, these violets were like a red rag to a bull. They saw in this not aesthetics, but weakness. They saw a boy playing with toy soldiers while the grown uncles prepared for war. But they were silent, for now, because the numbers still added up. The economy was growing, policyholders' money flowed like a river, and it seemed that this banquet would last forever. James was obsessed with France. He considered America vulgar, dirty, and boring. His heart beat to the rhythm of Paris. He spent huge sums from the company budget on cultural ties, He sponsored lectures by French professors at Harvard, brought French artists and actors to New York. He sincerely believed that he was fulfilling a great mission to enlighten savage Americans. But in the eyes of pragmatic Yankees, this looked like betrayal. Why were American dollars, earned by the sweat of Midwestern farmers, going to support Parisian idlers? What irritated them most was how he mixed personal and corporate. In his understanding, Equitable was not a public company, but a family jewel box. If he needed to go to Europe on business, he chartered an entire deck on an ocean liner. If he hosted a dinner for partners, wines were served there whose cost exceeded the annual payout on an average policy. The boundary between mine and ours, in his head, had been completely erased. This was the era when rich people began building palaces for themselves on Fifth Avenue and country estates on Long Island, competing in architectural absurdity. James bought the Oaks estate in Bay Shore, where he created a real miniature Versailles. Dozens of servants worked there, whose sole task was to maintain the illusion that it was not the 20th century in democratic America, but the 18th century in absolutist France. But the worst was not happening in the stables or banquet halls. The worst was happening in the accounting books. To maintain such a lifestyle and pay dividends to shareholders, Equitable began getting involved in risky Wall Street syndicates. Under the leadership of the Old Guard, which also wanted a piece of the pie, and with James's indulgence, the insurance giant began playing the stock market like a seasoned speculator. They used free capital, those very monies accumulated thanks to the tontine system, to buy stocks in railroads, gas companies, and banks. This was the Gilded Age in all its glory. On the outside, marble, violets, and French speech. On the inside, cynical schemes, insider trading, and the use of clients' funds for the directors' personal enrichment. Everyone was bound by mutual complicity. The directors turned the blind eye to James's antics because he did not interfere with their stealing. And James did not meddle in debits and credits as long as they paid his bills for horse oats and champagne. It seemed that this symbiosis of vice and luxury was unbreakable. But James made a mistake. He forgot that envy is fuel that burns brighter than coal. His lifestyle became too public. He became too noticeable. He irritated not only the poor, but also other rich people whom he did not admit to his closed club. And most importantly, he irritated James Alexander, the company president. Alexander understood. In a year, Hyde would turn 30. He would gain full control. And then he could fire the old thieves to hire new ones, his French friends. Alexander and his clique began preparing a coup. They needed only a pretext, a spark that would ignite the barrel of gunpowder of public indignation. They needed James to do something so outrageous that even bought judges and senators could not protect him. And James, in his endless naivety and narcissism, was already sending out invitations to the event that would become his scaffold. He was preparing a ball that was supposed to be the triumph of his taste, but became a memorial service for his reputation. In New York at the beginning of the 20th century, there existed a battlefield much more brutal than the trenches of World War I. On this field, they did not use mustard gas and shrapnel. Here, they killed with an icy glance, refusal of a bow, and, most terribly, the absence of an invitation ticket. It was a war for status, and James Hazen Hyde, despite his millions, was in a precarious position in this war. To understand the context, one must recall Mrs. Caroline Astor. This woman was the unofficial queen of New York. It was she, along with her faithful adjutant Ward McAllister, who compiled the famous list of the 400. It was believed that exactly 400 people could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. If you were on this list, you existed. If not, you were social dust, no matter how much money you had in the bank. Old money hated new money. They looked at industrialists and financiers as barbarians who burst into the temple with dirty boots. James's father, Henry Hyde, never sought to get on this list. He did not care about balls. He was only interested in power. But James was different. He craved recognition not as a shark of capitalism, but as a refined aristocrat. And in this lay his tragedy. For the stern Wall Street bankers, he was too French, too soft, a clown with violets. And for the snobs from Mrs. Astor's list, he was the son of that very insurance man, an upstart with overly loud laughter and overly bright vests. He was stuck between two worlds, belonging to neither, and he decided to break through by force. His weapon became culture. If New York did not accept his rules of the game, he would make New York play by Paris's rules. In January 1905, James learns that the great French actress Gabrielle Réjean is coming to New York on tour. She was not just a star, she was an icon of style, a muse to artists, a woman whose name thundered across all of Europe. For Hyde, this was a chance. He decided to host a reception in her honor, but such a reception that it would eclipse everything America had ever seen. This was not just a party. This was an act of social aggression. He chose the date, January 31st. He chose the place, Sherry's restaurant. This was a symbolic decision. At that time, the elite was divided into two camps, those who went to Delmonico's and those who preferred Louis Sherry. Sherry's was more fashionable, more European, more expensive. Hyde did not just rent a hall, he effectively rented time and space. The concept was grandiose, to recreate the atmosphere of the French royal court of the 18th century. All guests had to come in costumes from that era. This was a requirement that immediately weeded out random people. A marquise or duchess's costume cost hundreds of dollars. It had to be sewn to order by the best tailors. Thus, Hyde made the entire New York elite work for his vanity a month before the ball, discussing outfits for his party. But the enemies were not asleep. James Alexander, president of Equitable, watched these preparations with grim satisfaction. He understood that Hyde was digging his own grave. Alexander began a quiet whisper campaign. In the corridors of clubs, in smoking rooms, on the exchange, rumors began to circulate. Have you heard what the kid is planning? He's going to play king while we're working here. Alexander knew that Hyde's social ascent would cost him his career, and he was ready to give the falling man a push. Hyde, however, was blind. He was busy approving the guest list. 600 invitations were sent to the most influential people in America. Senators, bankers, heiresses of old families. Receiving an invitation to the Hyde Ball became a matter of honor. To refuse was impossible. It meant admitting you were out of the game. To come meant kissing the ring of the upstart. Society was boiling. It was a mixture of envy, contempt, and greedy curiosity. Hyde hired the best architect of that time, Stanford White, a man with an equally scandalous reputation and impeccable taste, so that he would turn the restaurant into a palace park. White proposed a mad idea: to hide the banquet hall walls with lattices entwined with ivy and bring live flowers from greenhouses despite the winter. This was a challenge to nature. This was a challenge to common sense. But most importantly, this was a challenge to America's Puritan morality. Hyde wanted to show that money gives the right to a fairy tale. He did not understand one thing. In 1905 America, they forgave theft, forgave ruthlessness, forgave even murders of competitors. But America never forgave useless, screaming, provocative luxury. Especially if that luxury was paid for with money that people saved for their funerals. James Hazen Hyde stood on the threshold of his 30th birthday. He thought that this ball would become his coronation, the official assumption of power over the empire. He wanted to prove to everyone, Alexander, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, that he was not just his father's son, but an independent force. He was building the scenery for his triumph, not noticing that in fact he was building the scaffold on which he himself would ascend under the applause of the public. The scenery was almost ready. The orchestra was tuning the violins. The champagne was chilling. Only hours remained until the catastrophe. In those years, the Atlantic Ocean turned into a trade route for the most cynical commodity in human history. From America to Europe went steamships loaded with gold, beef, and steel. And back, from the old world to the new, they brought titles. This was the era of dollar princesses, dukes, counts, and marquises whose ancestral castles leaked and wine cellars were empty, sailed to New York with one goal: to exchange their loud surnames for the checkbooks of American industrialists. James Hazen Hyde perfectly understood the rules of this exchange. His ball was not just a party, it was a showcase, a huge human auction disguised as a masquerade. Here, among garlands and music, marriage contracts were concluded that resembled corporate merger agreements. Family patriarchs, such as the Vanderbilts or Goulds, looked at their daughters not as brides, but as liquid assets with which one could buy a ticket into history. Imagine this scene: the hall of Sherry's restaurant, the air thick with the smell of perfume and cigar smoke. In the corner stands a group of men. They are not dancing, they are discussing figures. My daughter gets a dowry of $5 million, and in exchange, we want a title no lower than Duke. This is not an exaggeration. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the most famous dollar princess, was sold to the Duke of Marlborough exactly like that. At Hyde's ball, there were dozens of such brides and dozens of potential buyers from impoverished European nobility whom James personally summoned from across the ocean, paying for their first-class tickets. For James Hyde, this evening was also a deal, but of a different kind. He was not looking for a duchess wife at that moment. He was trying to buy himself a new nationality. He was trying to buy a French soul with American dollars. His bride that evening was France itself, in the person of the actress Gabrielle Réjeanne. Gabrielle Réjeanne was a star of the Parisian stage, a rival to the great Sarah Bernhardt. She was the embodiment of everything Hyde adored: capricious, talented, incredibly expensive to maintain. James invited her to New York not just as a guest. He built the entire evening around her, like a jeweler creates a setting for a huge diamond. This was an unprecedented act of worship. In the middle of the evening, the music fell silent. The guests, rustling silk and velvet, parted. A real palanquin, a litter adorned with flowers and precious fabrics, was carried into the hall. Madame Réjeanne sat enthroned on it. 4 sturdy men in liveries carried her through the entire hall to a specially built stage. It looked like the ritual of a pagan deity. American millionaires, men who owned railroads and coal mines, stood and applauded the French actress who was carried in like an idol. But behind the scenes of this theater of the absurd reigned icy calculation. The European guests, whom Hyde so diligently entertained, laughed at him behind his back. For a true French aristocrat, James was simply le petit Américain, a little American who put on a wig and thinks he has become Louis. They drank his Pol Roger champagne, ate his lobsters, accepted his expensive gifts, but contempt was read in their eyes. This was a classic deal with the devil. Hyde bought their presence, but could not buy their respect. The most cynical part of the evening was the dinner. The menu was composed to emphasize status, not taste. Every dish bore the name of a French classic or monarch. But the guests sitting at the tables were not discussing Voltaire at all. They were discussing how much the pearls around Mrs. Astor's neck cost, and whether Equitable could handle the dividend payout next quarter. This was a wedding of money and vanity, where the maître d'hôtel acted as the priest and the buffet of hors d'oeuvres served as the altar. James Hazen Hyde sat at the head of the table, beaming with happiness. He was dressed in the costume of a member of a hunting club from the time of Louis XV, with a tricorn on his head. He looked at the hall and saw success. He saw the elite of 2 continents gathered under one roof at his expense. He did not notice that these people were predators. Europeans sought money to patch the roofs of their castles. Americans sought titles to cover their humble origins. And Hyde himself was just a wallet that paid for this banquet. He thought he was the director of the play, but in fact, he was a producer who was about to go bankrupt. That evening, another significant moment occurred that historians often overlook. Among the guests was photographer Joseph Byron. Hyde, wanting to immortalize his triumph, allowed him to take photos. This was a fatal decision. Magnesium flashes illuminated the hall, capturing faces, costumes, mountains of food, and rivers of wine. These photographs were supposed to become a family album, a memory of the great night, but instead, they became material evidence. When a few days later these shots hit the newspapers, the public would see not an elegant ball, but a grotesque orgy of the rich. The photograph of Hyde in a French wig and breeches would become a symbol of betrayal of American values. He sold his reputation as a serious businessman for the opportunity to play French marquis for one evening. And the price of this deal turned out to be higher than any bill presented by Sherry's restaurant. The deal of the century took place. Hyde got his night of glory, and fate presented him with a bill that he would have to pay for the rest of his life. When the music fell silent and the last drunk guests drove home, James Hazen Hyde was left alone with his true master. This master was real estate. We are used to thinking that people own houses, but in the case of the Hyde dynasty, houses owned people. The architecture of their lives was designed to suppress, inspire awe, and create a vacuum in which any human voice would sound pathetic and unconvincing. The heart of this stone web was the Equitable Building on Broadway 120. This was not just an office, it was a temple dedicated to the god of reinsurance. When James's father built it, he ordered the most expensive materials that could be found to be used. The walls were clad in Carrara marble, the columns carved from granite, and the floors laid with mosaics worthy of Byzantine basilicas. But this luxury was cold. The building was designed as a fortress. Massive doors, heavy grates on the vault windows, endless corridors in which the echo of footsteps sounded like the hammer blows of a judge. Inside this stone sack, James had his own little world, his office. It was a space where reality was distorted. While the clerks below sat shoulder to shoulder at oak tables in stuffy halls, up above, in the Holy of Holies, silence reigned. Hyde's personal office was stuffed with antiques,
But these were not cozy family heirlooms. These were trophies. Bronze statues, heavy velvet draperies that were never fully parted, creating eternal twilight. It smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and furniture polish here. But the true architecture of his loneliness was revealed not in the office, but in his country estate, Oaks, in Bay Shore on Long Island. This place was supposed to become paradise, but became a golden cage. The house was enormous, dozens of rooms, most of which stood empty for months.
The servants called these rooms the dead zone. They entered them only with ostrich feather dusters to brush the dust from furniture on which no one sat. James's relationships with the staff, this is a separate chapter in the history of his isolation. The estate's staff consisted of more than 40 people. It was a small army: butlers, footmen, maids, cooks, gardeners. But for Hyde, they were invisible. The etiquette of the time required that a servant disappear, pressing against the wall if the master passed by. James lived in a house full of shadows. He had a valet whose sole morning duty was to properly select and prepare a little bouquet of violets for the master's lapel. Imagine the level of absurdity. An adult man received a salary equivalent to a miner's income just for knowing how to handle flowers and pins. But James's main love, his true home, were the stables. It was here that the architecture of madness reached its peak. The stable at Oaks resembled a wedding palace more than a place to house animals. The walls were paneled with varnished wood, the floors tiled and washed with soap twice a day. In the tack room, where saddles and harnesses were stored, display cases gleamed with glass and silver, as if it were Tiffany's jewelry store. James ran a telegraph line straight to the stable. This detail says more about his psyche than any diagnosis. He wanted to manage the financial empire without dismounting from the horse, inhaling the smell of hay and leather, and not the smell of sweat and ink from his employees. Horses were ideal companions for him. They were beautiful, silent, and insanely expensive. They did not judge him, did not plot intrigues, and did not demand reports on profits and losses. This architecture created a false sense of security. When you live behind walls a meter thick, when your feet tread carpets in which shoes sink, when any of your whims is fulfilled by a noiseless shadow in livery, you begin to believe that you are untouchable. James looked at the world through the windows of his private train car, through the stained glass of his office, through the crystal of glasses. He lost tactile contact with reality. He did not feel the cold that pierced the bones of New York's poor that winter. He did not hear the hum of discontent growing on the streets. His house was designed to keep noise out. But the architects did not foresee one thing. Walls can protect from wind and rain, but they cannot protect from the truth. It was precisely in these luxurious, echoing halls that James Hazen Hyde was most vulnerable. He had no real friends. Those who drank his wine envied him. Those who worked for him feared or despised him. He was the king of an empty castle. In the evenings, when he sat alone in the dining room designed for 40 people, under a huge chandelier of Bohemian crystal, the sound of his own fork striking porcelain was the only sound breaking the silence. This was loneliness of astronomical scale. He built scenery of greatness around himself, but forgot to fill it with life. And when the outside world began knocking on his oak doors, first quietly in the form of newspaper articles, and then loudly in the form of court summonses, it turned out that inside this fortress, there was no one to hold the defense. The walls were strong, the marble eternal. But the man inside was fragile, like a dried violet flower. The architecture of power turned into a mausoleum while its owner was still alive. And cracks were already running across the facade, although James, blinded by the shine of his chandeliers, still refused to notice them. The morning after the ball, the champagne went flat, and the rose petals began to rot. In nature, this process takes days, but in the world of big finance, the rotting of James Hazen Hyde's reputation happened instantly. We are used to thinking that empires fall from barbarians at the gates, but the history of Equitable proves the opposite. Empires die from cancer that consumes them from within. And this tumor had been growing for years, hidden behind marble facades and velvet curtains. The catastrophe began not with the police, but with betrayal. The man who dealt the first blow was neither a prosecutor nor a journalist. It was James Alexander. That very uncle who had held James on his lap in childhood, that very company president who swore loyalty to the late father. Alexander was an old, cunning fox. He understood that the photographs from the ball in 18th century costumes were the perfect weapon. He used them not to shame Hyde, but to declare him incompetent. In mid-February 1905, a document signed by Alexander and another 35 top managers landed on the board of directors' table. It was an ultimatum. It stated that James Hazen Hyde, due to his age, temperament, and scandalous behavior, could not manage assets worth $400 million. This was an attempt at a palace coup. Alexander hoped that Hyde, scared of the scandal, would quietly resign, leaving control of the company to the adults. But James dug in. His father's blood awakened in him. He refused to leave. And then Alexander opened Pandora's box. He leaked the information to the press. New York newspapers pounced on this story like a pack of hungry dogs. Joseph Pulitzer, owner of the New York World, personally gave the order to destroy Hyde. The media execution began. Every day on the front pages came caricatures. Hyde was drawn as a French poodle, as Louis XIV scattering gold coins, as a capricious child playing with blocks labeled widow's savings. And it was here that the real rot came out. Journalists began digging deeper than just banquet menus. They got to the syndicates. It turned out that Hyde's and his circle's luxurious life was paid not just by high salaries. There was a scheme that today would be called insider trading and embezzlement on a massive scale. Equitable directors, including Hyde and Alexander, created private investment pools. They bought securities, railroad stocks or bonds, at low prices on their personal accounts. Then, using their official positions, they sold these same securities to their own company, Equitable, but at inflated prices. They pocketed the difference. This was classic corruption. The company bought assets not because they were beneficial to the policyholders, but because it was profitable for the directors. The free capital, accumulated over decades, turned into a personal trough for the board of directors. And James Hazen Hyde was the face of this system. The public no longer laughed at his violets. The public was furious. People who had paid $5 a month for years, denying themselves food, realized that their money was being used by some dandy to buy lobsters for an actress. In panic, the board of directors tried to save the situation. They hired an independent committee for the investigation. It was headed by Henry Clay Frick, a steel magnate, Carnegie's partner, a man with a reputation for being ruthless but honest. Hyde and Alexander thought Frick was their man, who would write a soft report, scold them for immodesty, and close the case. This was a fatal mistake. Frick approached the matter like a pathologist. He dissected the accounting and was horrified. His report, published in the spring of 1905, became a bomb. Frick did not mince words. He stated that both Hyde and Alexander, and the entire board of directors, were mired in corruption. There is not a single honest person in this company. That was the unspoken verdict. He recommended firing everyone, both the president and the vice president. For James, this was a stab in the back. He found himself in complete isolation. His friends on Fifth Avenue stopped answering calls. His dinner invitations were returned unopened. In the clubs where he had once been a star, silence fell at his appearance. He became a toxic asset. Even the servants in his own house began to look at him askance. Hyde's psyche began to fail. He saw conspiracies everywhere. And he was right. Behind the scenes, a battle of bigger sharks was already underway. Edward Harriman, the railroad magnate and one of America's richest men, circled around the wounded Equitable, hoping to buy the controlling stake from Hyde for a song. Morgan, Rockefeller, all of them were waiting for James to break. Inside the company, chaos reigned. Clerks were not working. They were reading newspapers. Sales of new policies stopped. Policyholders began storming the offices, demanding their money back. The great tower on Broadway, which seemed an unshakable rock, trembled. The myth of reliability collapsed. James Hazen Hyde sat in his office, surrounded by tapestries, and understood that he had lost. Not because he was a bad manager, although he was, but because he broke the main rule of old money: steal quietly. If he had not thrown that damned ball, if he had not teased the geese with his French pronunciation and red heels, the system would have continued to work. It was not the financial machinations that ruined him, but the violation of the aesthetic code. He made the rot visible. And society, which was ready to tolerate hidden theft, could not tolerate overt, brazen, and costumed theft. The point of no return had been passed. Ahead was only the abyss. In the summer of 1905, stifling heat stood in New York. But for James Hazen Hyde, the temperature in the city was irrelevant. He was in the epicenter of a hellish inferno of another kind. It was the summer when American themists decided not just to punish one person, but to gut an entire industry. The event entered history as the Armstrong investigation, but in essence, it was a public tribunal over the era. The scene for the climax was prepared not in a ballroom, but in the stuffy room of City Hall. The chief executioner was not a judge, but the committee's lawyer, Charles Evans Hughes. Remember this name. In years to come, he will become governor of New York, and then Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But in those days, he was the bearded iceberg. Man-machine, man-logic. The absolute antipode of Hyde. If James was the embodiment of emotions and spending, then Hughes was the embodiment of Puritan asceticism and figures. On September 6th, the hearings began. There was standing room only in the hall. People hung on the windowsills. All of America wanted to see how the Prince with Violets would answer for the stolen millions. When Hyde entered the hall, a whisper passed through the crowd. Even here, going to the scaffold, he did not change himself. He was dressed to the nines, his mustache perfectly waxed, and in his lapel, as a challenge to the whole world, a fresh bouquet of Parma violets flaunted again. He thought that his charisma would work here, too. This was his last illusion. Hughes did not shout. He began methodically, question by question, to skin Hyde. He asked not about morality, but about entries. "Tell me, Mr. Hyde, Is it true that the company paid a check for $200,000 for the ball at Sherry's restaurant? I reimburse these expenses from personal funds, Hyde parried. But initially, the check was issued from the equitable account, isn't it? Do you consider it normal to use widow's money as your personal interest-free credit? The silence in the hall was deafening. Hyde tried to justify himself, speaking about representative expenses and strengthening ties with France. But under Hughes's icy gaze, these words sounded like the ravings of a madman. Hughes pulled out documents on the syndicates. He showed how Hyde bought stocks through dummy companies and resold them to his own company with a markup. This was the mathematics of theft, laid out on the board before the entire country. But the real tragedy, the death of the king, happened a little earlier, behind closed doors. While Hughes prepared his questions, James realized that he no longer controlled the situation. Pressure was coming from all sides. Creditors demanded money, the press demanded blood, and Wall Street sharks demanded his shares. The key moment came on June 9th. James Hazen Hyde, cornered, broken by the betrayal of Uncle Alexander and threats of prosecution, made a deal that forever erased him from business history. Thomas Fortune Ryan entered his office. He was a financier of a completely different caliber, quiet, unnoticeable, but deadly dangerous. Ryan put a check on the table. The amount was ridiculous for the scale of the empire, $2.5 million. For this money, he was buying 502 shares of Equitable Life. Ponder the tragedy of this arithmetic. 502 shares gave control over 51% of the votes. The company's assets amounted to $400 million. James Hazen Hyde sold power over $500 million, in modern money equivalent hundreds of billions, for $2.5 million. He sold his father's legacy at scrap metal prices. At the moment he signed the sales contract, James Hazen Hyde died as a historical figure. He ceased to be the financial Napoleon. He became just a rich, unemployed man. He left the building that his father built, knowing he would never enter it again as owner. Elevators, marble, gold in the vaults. All of this now belonged to Thomas Ryan. The reaction of family and society was devastating. He was considered a weakling. Newspapers wrote, "Hyde sold his birthright for a mess of pottage." But the most terrible blow was what happened after the sale. He thought that by giving up the shares, he would buy himself peace, that the persecution would stop. But the Armstrong investigation continued with new force. Selling the shares did not absolve him of responsibility for past sins. In the fall of 1905, James found himself in a complete vacuum. He had money from the sale of shares, but in New York, there was nowhere for him to spend it. No decent club let him through the door. No bank wanted to do business with him. His name became a byword, a synonym for corporate greed and stupidity. The point of no return was crossed physically in December. James Hazen Hyde stood on the deck of the ocean liner La Lorraine, sailing to France. He watched as the Statue of Liberty and the outlines of Manhattan receded. He was not leaving on a trip. He was leaving into exile. He was leaving behind his father's grave, a ruined career, and a country that hated him. In his luggage were costumes that had nowhere else to wear, and stacks of newspapers calling him a thief. The emotional peak of this story is not in the shouts in the courtroom, but in the silence of this cabin. A 30-year-old young man who had everything now sailed into emptiness. He was rich, healthy, and free, but inside,
he was dead. That ball at Sherry's restaurant, that night of triumph, cost him his life. He exchanged an empire for one dance with an actress. And looking at the cold waves of the Atlantic, he perhaps for the first time realized the real price of those 15,000 roses. The price turned out to be eternal oblivion.
Paris welcomed the exile with open arms, but these were the embraces of an expensive courtesan who loves a client exactly as long as he has a checkbook. James Hazen Hyde lived in France for 35 years. To an outside observer, it looked like an endless vacation. He bought a mansion on Rue Adolphe Yvon, number 18. He married Countess Martha Leishman, finally allying himself with that very European aristocracy he so idolized. It seemed he had won. He got titles, dinners, and recognition. But if you look closely, this was the life of a ghost in a museum. James turned his house into a mausoleum of a bygone era. He continued to wear old-fashioned mustaches that went out of fashion even before World War I. He continued to host receptions where dishes were served from the menu of that very fateful ball. He was frozen in time, like a fly in amber. And while he played aristocrat in Paris, in New York, there was physical destruction of his memory. The symbolic point in the dynasty's history was set on January 9, 1912. On that cold morning in New York, the Equitable Building caught fire. That very building that his father built, that very city within a city that was supposed to stand forever. The fire was monstrous. Water in the fire hydrants froze, turning the facade into an ice sculpture. 6 people died. The building burned to the ground. When a telegram with this news was delivered to James in Paris, it is said he did not utter a word. It was mysticism. The Hyde Empire was destroyed legally in 1905, and 7 years later it was destroyed physically by fire. The fire erased the offices where intrigues were woven, destroyed the marble on which great financiers walked, and burned the archives holding the secrets of the syndicates. On the site of the ashes, they built a new skyscraper, but it no longer bore the imprint of the Hyde's personality. It was just a faceless office. Time passed, and the mathematics of the curse began working against James. The money from the sale of shares was enormous, but inflation, the Great Depression, and unsuccessful investments gradually eroded the capital. James did not know how to earn. He knew only how to spend. His marriage fell apart. The Countess grew tired of life with a man obsessed with the past. And then came 1940, World War II. The irony of fate reached its apogee. James Hazen Hyde, the man who spent his whole life trying to become more French than the French themselves, was forced to flee from his beloved France. The Nazis entered Paris. Luftwaffe officers requisitioned his mansion on Rue Adolphe Yvon. Those very halls where James had collected a collection of Napoleonic relics were now trampled by German boots. His collection of books and works of art was looted. What he had collected for decades disappeared in trains heading to Berlin. In 1941, James Hazen Hyde returned to New York. But this was not the return of the prodigal son. This was the appearance of a ghost. He was 65 years old. The city he had left as a young dandy had changed beyond recognition. In place of his friends' mansions rose concrete jungles. Rockefeller Center pierced the sky. The era of the Gilded Age, with its balls and carriages, seemed as ancient as the Roman Empire. The worst thing for Hyde was that no one recognized him. He walked down Fifth Avenue, and passers-by saw just a strange old man in an outdated overcoat. No one whispered, "Look, that's the Hyde who spent $200,000 on roses."
he was forgotten. Oblivion turned out to be more terrible than hatred. Hatred confirms your significance. Oblivion erases you from reality. He settled in the Savoy Plaza Hotel. His life shrank to the size of a hotel room. There was no more the Oaks estate with 40 servants, no more stables with 70 horses. Only one valet and memories remained. He began selling off the remnants of his collections. The auctions passed quietly. Things that once cost fortunes went for pennies because tastes had changed. No one needed heavy tapestries and gilded carriages anymore. The world wanted modernism, plastic, and speed. James Hazen Hyde became a living anachronism. He outlived all his enemies. Alexander died, Hughes became an icon of justice and retired, the Equitable Building burned and was rebuilt, and James still lived. He turned into a custodian of useless knowledge. He could talk for hours about how to properly harness a 4-horse team, but in the age of automobiles, this skill was as useful as striking fire with flint. The final act of his fall was quiet. He moved from New York to Saratoga Springs, a resort town that also lived in the past. There, in the Gideon Putnam Hotel, he spent his last year. He sat in a wicker chair on the veranda, looking at the park, and, perhaps, seeing not trees, but the walls of Sherry's banquet hall entwined with ivy. He had enough money for a comfortable old age. He did not die in a flophouse like many tragic heroes. But he lost something greater. He lost meaning. His surname, which should have stood in the same row as the Morgans and Rockefellers, became a footnote in insurance law textbooks. Hyde's great fall was not the roar of collapsing rocks. It was the quiet rustle of sifting sand. The empire did not explode. It simply evaporated, leaving behind an old man who, until the very end, continued to pin a wilting violet to his lapel every morning. Today, if you walk through Lower Manhattan and stop at 120 Broadway, you will see a massive building soaring into the sky. This is the Equitable Building. But this is not the palace that our hero's father built, and not the one where James Hazen Hyde planned his balls. That one burned down, and this, just an office anthill, a monument to corporate facelessness. Letters are carved on the facade, but few of the clerks hurrying inside with cardboard coffee cups know whose surname stood behind this name. The name of the Hydes was erased from the map of New York so thoroughly, as if it had been eaten away by acid. However, by irony of fate, James Hazen Hyde left behind a legacy much deeper than stone or steel. His legacy lives on, and it touches every one of you right now. Let's start with blood. The dynasty did not end with the exile with violets. James had a son, Henry Baldwin Hyde, and the fate of this man, perhaps the best atonement for the father's sins. Henry grew up in France, in the shadow of his father's disgrace. He saw how emptiness devoured James and chose the opposite path. When World War II began, the son of the man who danced away an empire did not flee. He joined the ranks of American intelligence, the Office of Strategic Services, which later became the CIA. Under the pseudonym Monsieur Henri, he returned to France, but not to balls, but to the underground. He coordinated the actions of the French resistance, risking his life every day. He prepared the ground for the Allied landing in Normandy. The son restored the family honor, not with a checkbook, but with personal bravery. After the war, he returned to the USA and became a successful lawyer, but never, hear me, never engaged in the insurance business. He kept away from Equitable's money as far as he could. But there is another legacy, bureaucratic, boring, and vitally important.
Remember that very ball at Sherry's restaurant and the Armstrong investigation that followed. The laws passed in 1906 as a result of the scandal are still in effect in the United States. They are known as the Armstrong laws. These laws prohibited insurance companies from gambling policyholders' money on the stock exchange. They banned those very syndicates and speculations by which James lived. They introduced strict reporting standards. Every time a modern insurance company reports to the regulator, it does so according to rules written because one rich heir decided to order 15,000 roses and feed guests lobsters. James Hazen Hyde unwittingly became the father of modern financial security. His greed became a vaccine that developed immunity in the system. There is also a cultural trace. James wanted America to love France so much that he founded the Alliance Française Federation in the USA. This organization exists to this day. If there are French language courses or a French cultural center in your city, it most likely operates thanks to the fund laid by Hyde. He dreamed of instilling in the Yankees a love for Molière and ballet. Well, he succeeded, if not in the way he planned. The story of James Hazen Hyde is a perfect parable about the price of wealth. We began our story with a paradox: the richest heir who died in oblivion. Now we can close this gestalt. His life proves that money is not energy. It is just a magnifying glass. It does not change a person. It only makes his qualities gigantic. The father's diligence turned money into an empire. The son's vanity transformed money into a catastrophe on a national scale. The party costing $200,000, or $7 million in today's money, lasted only 6 hours. But the hangover from it lasted half a century. James bought himself a place in history, but this place turned out to be in the Cautionary Examples section, next to the names of great bankrupts and swindlers. Today, looking at modern billionaires who buy social networks, launch rockets, or build bunkers, we often ask ourselves, why? Hyde's story gives the answer. They are trying to fill the same emptiness that James tried to fill with antique carriages and costumed balls. The fear of being forgotten. The fear of turning out ordinary. James Hazen Hyde died in the silence of the hotel in Saratoga Springs, clutching in his hand an invisible scepter of a non-existent kingdom. But if you listen closely, in the noise of Wall Street, in the rustle of insurance policies, and in the ringing of French cultural centers, you can still hear the echo of that distant waltz. The ball is over. The candles are extinguished. The guests dispersed 100 years ago. But the bill for this dinner has been paid, and the change that history received turned out to be surprisingly substantial.